Once again, I'm very grateful to RUSI for facilitating this and, of course, their ongoing support for our activity in the Commission. They're a true friend of us and they've been very, very supportive over many years. And I do hope that once the new Director General has got her feet firmly under the table and the world calms down, that may be a bit of a sort of forlorn hope, we'll have the privilege of welcoming her out to our head office in Maidenhead, and she can see our activities at first hand. Of course, as we know, RUSI is the world's oldest defence and security think tank. It still leads global debate on international diplomacy and a much admired and respected voice of calm and reason in today's rather challenging world. So as a fellow of the Institute, it's wonderful to be here. I'd also like to pass on my sincere thanks to Lockheed Martin for their generous sponsorship of this event and to welcome their representatives to our discussions today. And we hope this will be the start of a sort of a longer and fruitful partnership with our charitable foundation, the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation. And that supports much of the education and outreach work that we do and helps fund and work our 2,500 volunteers across the UK, which hopefully will expand more globally in the months and years ahead. So this is our second major event with RUSI over the last few years, and this is an important activity for us in many ways. Now, as the Vice Chair, I get the privilege of travelling across our global estate and meeting our people, and I'm always humbled when visitors come up to me at some of our sites and pass favourable comments on our cemeteries, our memorials, and especially our people who work extremely hard to keep them to the standards they are. Thankfully, the majority of those comments are pretty upbeat and full of praise for the work that we do. We take pride in discharging our duties to the 1.7 million men and women who we look after with attention to detail, with love and care. It's the least that we can do, and we try and do it well. However, as an organisation, if all we did was cut grass, clean headstones, deadhead roses, would be nothing more really than a council parks department, albeit with a global footprint. And our founder, 100 years or so ago, Fabian Ware, fought really hard to avoid just an outcome when he was negotiating the design of what is now the Commission. His nightmare during that negotiation towards the end of the First World War was a sort of faceless public works department taking responsibility for maintaining the cemeteries as just another strand of its sort of public works activity. In his mind, to do so would belittle the sacrifice of the fallen. It would devalue the Commonwealth nation's desire and duty to remember, to honour and to cherish. It would push remembrance, whether personal or collective, to the periphery. And he was absolutely right. So at the core of our Commission strategy, apart from lovingly looking after the cemeteries, is the mission to engage, to talk, to tell the stories of those who fell, and we capture that under the phrase forevermore. So our staff, our volunteers, our interns, our guides, all around the globe, make sure that the people they look after are not forgotten, and they encourage debate and conversation. So this event is part of that rich pageant of communicating and discussing with the public and with governments just what it means to commemorate and how we ensure its profound significance and contemporary relevance resonates in a world that is awash with contradictory, competing and often inaccurate communication channels. So our focus has been naturally towards the families, but today they are fewer in number. And we have different types of visitors. So we must think of the wider impact that our sites can generate for societies. How could we use commemoration to foster and enable diplomatic engagement? It's a welcome byproduct of our mission to care for the fallen, but it's one that absolutely chimes with our overall objective. And of course, it already happens. A few weeks ago, I welcomed President Macron and Prime Minister Modi to our cemetery in Marseille. They spent just under an hour chatting about shared sacrifice, about common tragedy, from a unified national perspective, a joint historic endeavour over the generations before, against the common foe. Two great leaders in thought at an event which starkly highlighted their connected heritage, yet sensitively placed in context some of today's challenges. I'm reminded of the Cross of Sacrifice we built in Dublin, in the Glasnevin Cemetery, their national cemetery, in 2014, signifying a new post-Troubles relationship between Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland, founded in shared commemoration, an example of international diplomacy. At the very tactical level, the Royal Naval Attaché, who last year went with his Russian counterpart to visit our cemetery in a rather windswept Murmansk to mark Remembrance Day. It transcends even those very fraught national relationships which exist between our two countries today. The children from France and Turkey, who in front of ambassadors, government ministers and military leaders told the moving stories of soldiers who died on the Gallipoli Peninsula. So this happens almost without thinking across the world. In January this year, I went with our Director General Claire Horton to Cape Town for the inauguration of the Labour Corps Memorial, accompanied by our President, Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal. And that commemorates 1,700 men from the South African Labour Corps who died during the First World War, but who the Commission had failed to commemorate. Each serviceman now is represented by an individually named African Iroko hardwood post set in South African granite, a material that is commonly used in our sites around the world. It's an extraordinary, powerful memorial. It was a very evocative ceremony that captured a moment of celebration and reconciliation. So this spirit of reconciliation and commemoration epitomizes much of our work around the world. It's an example of how we use commitment to commemoration to foster dialogue, international relations, and understanding. The cemeteries and memorials we tend were built to assuage overwhelming grief, not just of the families, but of nations. Today, as they sparkle in many, many countries across the globe, they continue to promote reflection on the consequences of war, recollections of past and present alliances, of international friendships, bonds which were gently nurtured and have been nourished on soil that was so frequently soaked with the blood of war. We welcome ownership in the Commission of this responsibility. So I'm delighted today to see representatives from many nations, Germany, France, Belgium, Poland, I could go on. They're all friends of the Commission. They share our desire to make sure that commemoration is fostered today and in the future, and it serves a meaningful purpose for today's generation. So today we're not going to find an answer. There's not going to be a great policy document at the end of this conversation that says this is the model for making commemorative-based diplomacy. It's about dialogue and it's about sharing ideas and sharing knowledge. And I'm sure our speakers and the Allied panel discussion will advance collective appreciation of the potential for this. And I hope we start to discuss, to make new connections, hear fresh thinking about the ways in which commemoration of those who died in the conflicts of the past can help us minimize confrontations in the future. So I welcome you all and hope to have a chance to speak to many of you later on this morning or perhaps over lunch later on today. So I suppose my next duty now is to introduce our keynote speaker, Baron Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, known to many of you here at the Institute, and of course a very distinguished diplomat. Amongst many appointments, I think we've got the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, permanent under secretary at the Foreign Office, ambassador to France, I could go on. And subsequently, of course, he served as the National Security Advisor. So there are few better, if I can say, who can relate commemoration and the tragic consequences of war to the very real art of diplomacy. Well, thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed, Vice Admiral, for that moving start to our discussion. May I, as another Vice Chair of this Institute, welcome everybody here to our newly refurbished building. RUSI has been in the business of commemoration, I think, from the very start, founded 200 years ago. Duke of Wellington was the principal mover behind our creation, and the current Duke of Wellington is still a very active trustee on our trustee panel. I speak to you as well wearing another hat, which I'll come to in a little moment, which is as now President, first Chairman of the Trust that built the Normandy Memorial to those fallen under British command in Normandy in the battles of 1944, a project in which we worked extremely closely with the Commission, and I will show one or two slides of what we have built there in a memorial which is, I think, entirely complementary to the magnificent cemeteries that the Commission maintain and use for the diplomatic purposes you talk about. Thinking about what to say today, it occurs to me that nations have different ways of commemorating their war dead. In my experience, though, none does it as well and as effectively as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in British and Commonwealth countries around the world. And in every post I've served in, from Singapore to France, I have always been to the Commonwealth War Graves, and I've found them renowned as places of dignity, of serenity, quite unlike any others. And if you'll permit me one personal story, on a visit to India with my family a few years ago, I went to St. Mary's Cemetery in Madras, Chennai. It has 100 Second World War graves there, one of whom was my uncle, who was killed there in a training accident in 1942 at the age of 21. I was the first member of the family ever to go to Desmond's grave, and of course it was immaculate, it was perfect. It was, you had to go through a rather tortuous path through an overgrown Anglican cemetery in order to get to the Commonwealth War grave behind it. But when you got there, it was just like all other Commonwealth War graves, with a very devoted Indian gardener who kept it immaculately. And it was a very, very moving and touching moment for me. In the country I know best, France, of course the war cemeteries on the Western Front and in Normandy are powerful reminders of the deep ties that bind our countries and our nations together. And every year, the ceremonies are well attended by French, national, local leaders, as well as British people, people from across the Commonwealth. You're talking on the panel later with my successor as ambassador in France, Ed Llewellyn, and he and I know very well the British ambassador crisscrosses the country to ceremonies in all parts of the country as the cycle of commemoration moves around from year to year. They're often attended by members of the royal family, especially in the main anniversaries. That always attracts enormous local attention, a great deal of goodwill. The most moving thing for me is the deep and genuine commitment of people in French towns and villages to preserving and transmitting the memory of those who came from overseas to defend their country, to liberate their country, and who never went home. I'm sure that's true more widely as well. But my first point is, as a 40-year diplomat, I say with emphasis that commemoration is an important part of diplomacy, and I think it always will be. We have a house in Normandy. I've been there for 30 years. Every year, the locals put up the banners on the beaches, welcome to our liberators. And they saw the veterans as liberators. They welcomed them every year. Many of them made family friendships that have gone down the generations. In our commune of a few hundred people, a little way back from the beaches, there is a single Commonwealth War grave in the local commune cemetery at the churchyard. The villagers still refer to him as our soldier, and every year school children are taken to the grave on the anniversary of his death and told about why he came to France, what he was fighting for, and what the reason was for having a Commonwealth War grave in their village. And that is true up and down the country and across many, many countries across the world. This is an important part of people understanding the shared history we have with many nations. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, there was a discussion about whether, after the last veteran of the First World War had died, there would be a falling off of interest in those extraordinary cemeteries along the Western Front. But that's emphatically not being the case. And I don't believe it will be the case for the Second World War either. I'll try and illustrate a bit what I think some of the continuing diplomatic trends are that mean that commemoration is changing, its nature is changing, but the importance of it and the commitment of people to commemorate is still as strong as ever. And that brings me really to the story of the British Normandy Memorial. They're completed. And I start with someone who is absolutely key in making that happen, a gentleman called Nick Whitchell, who can't, I fear, be here today. Nick was, many people will know, as the royal correspondent to the BBC for many, many years. Nick was approached about a decade ago by a veteran called George Batts, who felt that there should be a British national memorial to all those who fell under British command of General Montgomery in the battles starting on the 6th of June. He pointed to the fact that there was a US national memorial and a Canadian national memorial, which was the centre of their annual commemoration. And he thought that there should be a British memorial as well. And Nick took that idea and ran with it and helped George Batts write a proposal to the then British government, David Cameron's government. And the short version of a long story is that eventually the idea was accepted that it would be entirely appropriate to have a national memorial alongside the cemeteries, complementary to them, and that the case for doing that fast while the veterans were still there in order to see it built was a compelling one. And Ed Llewellyn, who was the Chief of Staff to David Cameron at that time, I think was very instrumental in getting to the point where we received £20 million from the LIBOR fund, that fund for banks that had broken the rules about setting exchange rate, subsequently topped up with another £7 million, which I managed to persuade the government to give us, and £3 million of sponsorship. It was a £30 million project. Nick found the ideal architect for us in Liam O'Connor, who produced this extraordinary design, both modern and very traditional. And we found a perfect site. You can't quite see the sea, but beyond the cows over there, in about a kilometre, there is the beach, Gold Beach, where many of the British troops landed on the 6th of June. And there are pictures of British tanks and armoured cars moving up over exactly that terrain on the 6th of June. We decided that it should embrace the entire Battle of Normandy, i.e. from the 6th of June to those who fell up to the 31st of August, when the battle passed over the Seine and the command of the army was handed over from Montgomery to Eisenhower. We decided it should include all military personnel of all nationalities, all services, and also, in an innovation, that it should include the merchant marine, who also played a very vital part. Excuse me. And although the Commonwealth War Graves archives were extremely useful to us, we had to do our own research to make sure that we got the roll of honour which was accurate. Now we have 22,440 men and 2 women. It's quite hard, of course, to add names to those graven in stone, date by date, through the battle, and I think we have only found 1 or 2 since we built it that we had to add. At that point, the issue moved to diplomacy, really, because we then had to secure a French agreement to building on a site which was of environmental sensitivity, which was in an area which was intended to form part of a bid for UNESCO World Heritage Site, and which required a certain amount of diplomacy to get French approval for it. The era of land gifted to nations for their war memorials is now over. We bought the land, a jigsaw of different parts of land, and we got it through the French planning system, thanks critically to support from President Macron. President Macron from early on was a strong supporter of this, and the President's support in France helps a great deal to navigate through the French administrative system. So we set to work and we built it, and with impeccable timing we started as COVID lockdown hit us, and we actually built it through the lockdown without access from the UK to the site. But we got there. We were counselled by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission on how to do it, to make it as easy as possible to maintain in the wonderful condition in which all CWGC cemeteries are maintained. Liam O'Connor, our architect, produced this design, and it was completed by a highly photogenic sculpture of 3 Marines landing on the beaches, which you have there, which has become the iconic picture that everybody wants, again with the sea just behind it. David Williams Ellis was the sculptor. After a certain amount of wariness, I think, on the part of the commune, having this rather odd thing parachuted into their commune, we are now seen as good citizens. And a very good sign is that the village use our grounds for their annual fetes and school festivals. We are now integrated into the community. The culmination for us came when the King, who has been our royal patron for many years, and President Macron opened the memorial officially on D-Day last year, and you may have seen the images in the wonderful sunshine of the 6th of June. Of course, at the same time, Her Royal Highness Princess Royal was at Bayeux at the cemetery there. Prince of Wales was also attending ceremonies, just to give a sense of the diplomatic power and impact of these occasions. And many world leaders, of course, attended the international ceremony. This is soft power in action. Another innovation of our memorial is that we built a separate memorial to those French civilians, many thousands of them, killed during the Battle of Normandy. And I think my last slide here, on the right here at the bottom, is a small but actually extremely beautiful memorial to the French civilians. And that helped a great deal, I think, to win French hearts for this memorial. Every time a French VIP goes there, they lay a wreath at the French memorial as well. And it underlines a trend which I wanted to say, and which absolutely fits what the Vice Chairman said, that is that commemoration is becoming more inclusive. I think reconciliation and inclusivity are important words as we take commemoration forward. And the French memorial here, the international ceremony at D-Day, which is attended by a vast number of heads of state and government. In past decades, Putin has come. He didn't come last time. Of course, the German Chancellor is there, and many others. I think reconciliation and inclusivity are important themes. And then the final point I wanted to make is the vital importance of passing the baton to the next generation. I think this is hugely important in ensuring the continuing diplomatic impact of commemoration and commemoration by British authorities overseas. From the very start of our memorial, we recognised that alongside the names graven in stone there, we needed a really good modern digital offering. We invested our scarce resources in a first-class app. This offers interactive tours, a searchable roll of honour, and most important of all, we began to research the personal stories behind the names on the memorial. And it's been wonderful to see the response from families up and down the country who have given us, been privileged to receive from them photographs, journals, letters of their loved ones, all of which are uploaded to the website. And I think this does a lot to bring to life for the internet generation what happened in those battles and why. To read the journal of an 18-year-old, the letters home to mum in the days before he was killed, I think gets across to young people more effectively than anything what was involved, what the level of sacrifice was, and to get them thinking about why, and why it's very important that their generation should take very seriously the diplomacy that is necessary to avoid war. We've now built, not on the photograph, a Winston Churchill Centre to host school parties and provide a cafe for tourists and so on. And you can also see here, not very clearly, we have had last year the Standing with Giants silhouettes. 1,750 were planted, if you like, for the summer last year, 1,750 being the number of people killed on the 6th of June in Gold Beach. And just to begin to visualize the scale of that sacrifice, I think was again a very powerful way of communicating to people. I'm glad to say we're having them back this next summer. They are a very powerful addition to the memorial. We had about 250,000 visitors last year. It feels like we are now fully integrated into the commemorative landscape in France, as well as the local community in Calvados. As I say, I think we do complement the work of the cemeteries by telling a rather wider story about the whole battle from the 6th of June to the 31st of August in an inclusive way. And best of all, our memorial is now maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves gardeners, who are also actually our ambassadors. If you go to the site, there's nobody from the Normandy Memorial Trust there, but there are the CWGC gardeners in their branded gardening kit, and they are really good at welcoming people and talking to them about the memorial and their work and the pride in their work. So I think that we now have a place which is there forever for remembering, for reflection, for learning, and this with the cemeteries is a powerful soft power tool for Britain and the Commonwealth around the world. So thank you once again. I look forward very much to a discussion among those who know a great deal more about the subject than me, but we're delighted to be hosting you all today in RUSI. Thank you. I should say is if I've said anything which encourage you to know more about the memorial, there is a very nice booklet produced by Nick Witchell. It's not full of pictures of Nick Witchell, but it has a lot of very, very interesting text, a number of the old photographs and some of the old documents we drew on. So I do encourage you to go by that. Now, if I've said anything that inspires anybody to make a comment, either about Normandy or about the link between diplomacy and commemoration, I'd be delighted to try and help. We have a little moment for people to come in. Yeah. Yes, questions are now, it's open for questions, please.
Thank you very much. Lord Evans, thank you very much for that wonderful speech. We had the privilege, Lady Evans and I had a privilege of being there on the 6th of June last year, and it was a magnificent event. And indeed, I have a relative who's on Pillar 1, killed on the 7th of June. An RAF bomber. And also, you may or may not know, but Vernon Coker is on the front panel, who was killed on D-Day, and that's the uncle of Lord Coker,
current Lord Coker,
named after him. So
yes,
it was good to pay tribute to Lord Coker's relative. My question is on the many stories, many voices, one commission, one mission. I had the privilege of walking the front line of the Somme with the late Richard Holmes, who was a well-known historian of the time, and he took us to the cemeteries, and he stood us all in the cemetery, and he told us about that cemetery. He told us, why is it here? And he explained the topography and the history of that cemetery. So when we see many stories, will those stories be based on history, on facts, rather than fiction or topical issues?
Yes. But I think what you say is very relevant as well to the thinking about the future of the Commonwealth War Graves estate as well as our own memorial, that I think people expect more and more to have explanatory material about what happened, why is the cemetery, what was the context for the battle. And for our memorial, we in fact had to buy more land than we wanted to because we had to make it contiguous with the village to get planning permission. So we bought a thin strip of land between the memorial site and the village. It has two advantages. It puts the memorial a little away from the toilets and the cafe and the workshops. But also there's a path that goes through, and we put on the path a series of pillars, small pillars, with inscriptions in them, with text in them, and some pictures about the battle. What happened before the 6th of June, on the 6th of June, how the battle developed, the battle around Caen, the breakout. And so as you walk towards the memorial, you get in English and in French descriptions of what was happening through from 6 June to 31 August. And we've also listed the names day by day on the memorial, so you can sort of chart the progress of the campaign. And I think there is a case for thinking about that. I don't know to what extent CWGC already do it, but including in the cemeteries and in and around them material that helps people to understand what was happening and why. Because I think people expect that now. And also, just going back to what I said about the digital offering, more and more can be online, especially if you've got Wi-Fi around the areas. We do have for the Normandy Memorial. People immediately get out their phones and look on their phones and expect to find there a lot more detail about the cemetery, about the people on it, about the background to them. So I think the digital future of commemoration is important. And that we have designed into this because we had the opportunity to start from scratch. But I'm sure the Commission are already well ahead of us on that. I do think it's important. But thank you for what you said. Many, many parliamentarians actually find that they had relatives. Another well-known name, now no longer in Parliament, Bill Cash. His father is on the memorial, and he was extremely moved to go on the 6th of June and see that as well. I'm sure many, many, many people will find that they have relatives one way or the other among our 22,442 names. Have I stimulated any other thoughts about diplomacy and commemoration, sir?
Andrew Figures, I'm a trustee of the Imperial War Museum.
Yes.
You gave some very good examples of how you've integrated with the French and how the local village plays a part in this. And of course, we see our political leaders taking part in these ceremonies. But of course, the really important lessons are to avoid this situation happening again, which we don't seem to be terribly good at learning. But how do you get this learning or this understanding into the main body of the population? Because I think if you were to look at the population today, however many million there are in this country, and their connection with that figure of 1,750 killed on the first day, it is pretty tenuous. And therefore, those who don't have a direct connection, how do you transmit the lessons to avoid such events as the Second War to them?
Well, you make a very good point that global war is becoming a very distant memory now for the current generation. In a way, it wasn't probably for any previous generation. I mean, between the First and Second World War, there was 20 years, and so many people lived their lives through 2 world wars. I mean, I think the annual cycle of commemoration has an effect, because especially now when it's all on media, on social media, especially for the big anniversaries, there's a great deal about what went on there. And things like having 1,750 individual commemorations of those killed gives you a sense of the scale of what went on. Of course, on the Western Front, it was massively greater than that. It is up to political leaders to use those moments, I think, to try and explain why it should never happen again. I think our experience of war over the last 20 years, I'm thinking of Iraq in particular, has made people very, very wary, I think, of committing British forces again to conflict. Of course, right as we speak, there is discussion going on about a British military force in Ukraine. I expect that that will come to Parliament and will be debated very closely and carefully before any decision is taken to do that. But you're right, I think we have to work harder as those events become more and more distant to keep them alive. I mentioned that I think and the Commission will have more details, that the attention paid, the number of people going to the First World War sites has not fallen all that much. More of it has moved online as people search for relatives in the searchable databases. There are more visitor centres, there's more opportunity for people to understand. And it just feels to me that it isn't fading out from memory in a way that I think we feared 10 or 15 years ago, perhaps before the full power of the internet and social media was felt. So I think there are opportunities in there for leaders, for all of us actually, to make sure we keep alive the memory of what can happen when you don't pay enough attention to resolving conflict peacefully. Certainly diplomats spend all their time doing that, I can promise you, and when they're retired as well. Madam, please. Lady just behind us. Yeah, tell me when to shut up is what the Vice Admiral is saying. I think a lady just behind you. No, please. Shall we have one more question? One more. I'm under your command.
Thank you. Victoria Richardson-Walden. I run the Landecker Digital Memory Lab at the University of Sussex. So I'm going to ask you a question about the digital side. Sorry. Yes. It's really great to see that the digital was planned into a new memorial from the beginning. And you mentioned how the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is kind of maintaining the physical site. I was wondering if you could talk about what funding and strategy and plans have been kind of already laid to maintain the digital elements, because so quickly when we go, I look at Holocaust sites particularly, and they have an app, and then a year later it's broken, security or hardware or software updates have stopped it working. So yeah, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you. You're right, it's expensive at the beginning, and we had to kind of draw breath and take a decision when money was extremely short and we were struggling to finish the physical construction of the memorial, to spend whatever it was, and it was tens of thousands of pounds, on a properly, professionally designed app, which must now be, I suppose, 3 or 4 years old. And I'm sure I'm no longer quite part of the kind of running of the trust, that they are having to spend money to keep it up. I think you need it done professionally. It's no good, somebody just doing it part-time, in the evenings. You need to employ a professional company and keep it up. It is actually our front door. I mean, it's our door on the world, and so I think it is worth devoting the resources to it. I mean, for all these sorts of memorials, and I think ours is quite unusual in its size, but there is an issue of ongoing revenue, of course. There is no government funding for it. The government were very generous in building it, but we have to raise our money to keep it going, and that is through sponsorship, through membership. We have all sorts of membership schemes for young people, through revenue from the shop, from the cafe, from the parking. You always have to be thinking of merchandising and so on to be raising money, but some of that money has to go to maintain the app in good condition, absolutely, because it's essential. And there is nothing more powerful than the stories. I think increasingly Commemoration is about stories, really, and they are the most moving things. We have our two ladies who are Princess Alexandra's medical reserves, who were killed on a warship, and we found all sorts of stories recently. Some Hong Kong people found that there'd been a group of Hong Kong people who were in the military, none of whom were killed. They're not on the memorial, but they've now set up a Hong Kong foundation to tell the story of their Hong Kong forebears. So it's an ongoing issue. I don't have an answer, but revenue is always a problem. It's quite a problem to maintain a memorial of that size, and we're delighted that the CWGC are doing it, but maintaining the app is just as important as maintaining the physical look of the memorial. Right, I think I've been instructed to wrap it up at that point. Thank you very much again, all of you. Thank you for your interest, and I look forward now very much to the panel discussion.
Well, I'm Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director General at RUSI, and really I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chair this session. And as Lord Ricketts already pointed out, RUSI has a long tradition of being involved in commemoration. And indeed what Lord Ricketts didn't say is actually for much of RUSI's history there was also a RUSI museum next door in Banqueting House which was devoted to commemorating many of the things which have happened in British military history. So that's been part of our heritage for a long time. We've had many thoughtful remarks already, I think, from Peter Hudson and from Lord Ricketts, which I certainly found moving and fascinating, particularly a deep dive into talking about the Normandy Memorial and how that works. But of course the Commonwealth War Graves organisation is a very multinational organisation, multinational in its sites, but also multinational, perhaps rather unique in that regard, multinational in terms of the fallen who are commemorated from many nations across our Commonwealth. And I think probably unique also, as has already come out, in terms of the respectful approach of the Commission, the focus on reconciliation and inclusivity, and finally and not least the personalised approach, which I thought we already had a discussion of, very important to link into people and their own stories. And certainly I know that many families today, even though several generations after the last major war in which we were involved, still think about history through the history of their own family. Most people are not scholars of international history, but they can understand history through the experience of their fathers and grandfathers and uncles and so on. And that's bringing that history home is an important contribution, maybe to the debates we are now having when we now have a major war raging in Europe now for 3 years of an intensity which is comparable to that facing Europe so many years ago. So I am really honoured to have this great panel. I understand we've got 5 speakers. One, Beatrice is online. Ed Llewellyn is going to be online shortly. Our ambassador to Rome. So I'm going to ask each speaker to make some introductory remarks, and then I'm sure we'll have quite a bit of time for questions, and we're aiming to finish at about 10 to 12. So for our first speaker, I'm delighted to have the South African High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, His Excellency Jeremiah Mamabolo. So please, Your Excellency.
Yeah?
Please do.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think Peter and Lord Ricketts have already laid the foundation, or what is core, what is central. And I want to say perhaps my participation coming from South Africa is a reminder to all of us the extent to which Africa was involved as well. And I think as we talk about this topic, the role of commemoration in diplomacy, it's important that we recollect all that and don't leave anybody behind. The contribution by quite a lot of it, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. I think Peter did mention the role that the South Africans also played, what we call the labor corps, to which I will talk to later on. But first I want to start off by saying, yes, indeed, we agree fully that this is truly relevant. It is important that we continue to look at this, to interrogate this topic, because it is a powerful tool. It's a soft power and a powerful tool in diplomacy. And it does all what has been spoken to already, the reconciliation, the reminder that there is an alternative to war, And as Lord Ricketts was saying, important to remind us that we shouldn't at all costs repeat what has happened. That war is something that we need to avoid at all costs. I've been 2.5 years now here as High Commissioner, and one of the events one always looks up to are the visits that we make into foreign European countries here, where we see many of people who participated in those wars. It makes you feel that you belong, part of the solidarity of a noble cause indeed, that our people, I can tell you, each one of us, as soon as we get to this grace, gravitate to your own area, and it's always a pleasure to see our own surnames in Zulus, and of course I end up interpreting for the others who have a problem in pronouncing those. But I think it's just the pride of knowing that as South Africans, we were also part of this noble mission that was for the good. We're happy also that this is global, that what unites us are the core values that we all hold. We saw that happen to us in our own struggle, that you indeed contributed also to our own liberation because of those core values. And also our people at that time were able to. Two things I want to say before, I'm sure I don't want to extend too much of your time. What we have seen, what I have seen as High Commissioner here, has been the manner in which this has been done, the dignified manner, the manner in which we've been persistent as RUSO and the Commonwealth World Graves to go even in those areas where there is conflict and continue to attend to this even during those times, of course taking into account the safety of those people who work in those areas. I have seen the amount of work you do in Gaza, in Israel, in Iraq, in Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, etc., etc. Before I stop my comment, I need to say something about what Peter mentioned, the new work now you are doing in Cape Town, and to say how much we appreciate that as South Africans. It's got a story. Lord Ricketts spoke about the stories about those individuals that were involved. Now, the little background to the Labour Corps is that they, even that time, discrimination, as you know our history, and I will not bore you with the details of our history, but even in war during those days, people were discriminated against. And so you had a situation where these people participated in war, but were not allowed to carry weapons because of their color. And so they came here, Europe, everywhere, and they participated as people who facilitated, cooks and whatnot, whatever minimal tasks that they were afforded. But they were part of the war, and many of them died. And the humiliation thing that happened to them is that when they went back home, when those now were recognized and they were rewarded for having participated in the war, given huge farms and so on, the Labour Corps were rewarded, were given bicycles and winter coats as their reward for having participated in the war. And so, what you are doing by putting that memorial in Cape Town is a restoration of dignity for the families of those people. You have made them realize that their contribution was not in vain, that they were not worth a blanket, a heavy coat in winter, but that they also made a contribution. And it is through the stories, telling the stories of those people, that indeed you have done quite a lot for the communities. The one thing we're talking with Claire and Peter is how we can continue to make this a living thing. Don't just put a memorial there. Make sure that that is living. It's part of the history. People can come there, as Lord Ricketts said. Some of that history you will get from the families of those people, who will then in turn be able to tell you what happened to their sons, how did they participate in this endeavor. But I can tell you as a South African, this has had such an impact to us all as a community, and I have no doubt it will contribute a great deal to race relations and reconciliation in my country. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much indeed for that moving contribution, and not least your reference to the importance of restoration of dignity, which I think was a very well made point. And can I apologise for the grass cutting or whatever it was outside? But I take it back. So I think for our next speaker, we're going to go online to Beatrice Heuser, who's a Senior Associate Fellow with the Institute, an old friend. And Beatrice, tell us where you're speaking from.
Speaking from Hamburg.
So again, very appropriate. So Beatrice, over to you.
Thank you very much. There's a bit of a time lag, as you all realise, between our communication, but I'll try to be not to have long silences where we can't communicate. Let me start by saying that I too was obviously very moved by the presentations we've just heard, the interventions we've just heard, and that I'm absolutely a total supporter of all the work of the War Graves Commissions and the Kriegsgräberfürsorge in Germany, etc., and also of what the Russians have been doing in this respect. Nevertheless, I'm going to be the odd one out. I'm going to be nasty, and I'm going to be talking about the point about contested memories and about diplomatic tensions over such commemorations. Now, I think there is an awful lot of things that one can do on the basis of common mourning with previous enemies and the previous adversaries. But common mourning about the dead or for the dead is not the same as relinquishing the narratives of what led to wars or the justifications of those wars. And I want to give you a very some particular examples there. I think the situation that Lord Ricketts has faced in France is really very particularly easy. And I think that would be the same for war graves in Belgium and anything to do with the Netherlands or some other countries there who were fighting on the same side in the two world wars. So although I am fully aware of the fact that there's lots and lots of sibling rivalry between France and Britain, there is not really a real enmity to overcome there. But even with all that understanding between France and Britain and being on the same side and the wonderful initiatives now for close cooperation with regard to Ukraine, let me just point out that there are some differences between the way in which the British see the world and in which other countries, other cultures see the world. And let me just give you that example. There is a rather lovable tendency in Britain to think of wars a bit as of football matches. You might remember the jingle of 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. This is not shared by other cultures. So you might remember the 2005 commemorations of Trafalgar, where the French were very graciously invited to bring their aircraft carrier and to actually head a big procession of ships to commemorate these days. Well, the French played along, but I do still know French people in the French Navy who didn't quite get it. You know, how you can celebrate your own defeat in that way, even if it is with very close friends now, is something that doesn't necessarily translate across cultures. And again, I think we will hear more from, I think, is it Mr. Bakken who is there with us from the Kriegsgräberfürsorge? I'm very interested to hear what he's going to say about the cooperation there with Russia, which may well be the last area of cooperation that may be working well with the Russians. But it's the cooperation with the Germans, I think, is also quite unique, because I think there are few countries that have had really nasty Nazi pasts that have so thoroughly overcome that particular part of their own politics and their own ideology and cast it aside. So I think there's absolutely no concerns and worries, despite the AFD and its successes in election polls. There's no difficulty with talking to Germans about how the Second World War was a bad thing on their side and a just war on the side of the Allies. But this is, I think, quite unique. I think you will find it very difficult, for example, with Gallipoli or something like that, to get to the narrative where you say, well, admit that you were wrong, or to say to another side, you know, admit that we were on the just side of this war and you were not on the just side. So I think that's something that that has to be taken into account. You should not expect that you can get to this idea of conflicting narratives and trying to sort out conflicting narratives, even over the graves of soldiers, into areas where there's conflict is ongoing right now. Let me just give you a small anecdote of my experience when I was a member of the German-Russian Historians Commission. This was in the early 2000s. It was extraordinary, not hard work, but it was like walking through molasses. We got very, very little response from the Russians in terms of anything that we wanted very much to come clean and say, look, we are admitting all these things that the Germans did, here are all the documents, we want to open them. And the Russians were not at all inclined to do the same for their side when we were talking about the Second World War or the First World War. And it was just simply not, I think in short, I think in a lot of cultures and a lot of countries, people might, in a very small clandestine family situation, a friend situation, over the kitchen table, criticize their government, criticize their own history. I don't think they will do this to foreigners, not even in a setting where you're mourning common graves. And there's one other thing I want to say before I hand over back to Malcolm, which is that I greatly admire Lord Ricketts' approach and the approach of saying we must ensure that we never do this again. We must make sure that our own side, we always have diplomacy, etc. There is the other side, however. And one of the problems, I think, with the whole Christian narrative of looking for guilt on your own side is that you might be looking for a speck in your own eye, when in fact it is the other side's eye that contains the beam. So just saying we don't want to be aggressive, we are all NATO is all about deterrence, about not having another war, of making sure that the other side doesn't start another war. But not everybody is so keen to avoid war, as we see by the aggression against Ukraine. So I don't think it's enough simply to say we have to work on our own side. And I think you'd have to be overly optimistic if you think that even working together with, say, Russia, with the War Graves Commission, and that's why I'm very interested to hear what Dirk Bakken has to say, that is enough to bring them round to our side to say, also, we want to do nothing but the deter and want to make sure there's never again going to be such a war. Thank you very much.
Beatrice, you didn't disappoint in adding lots of really interesting questions to our conversation, drawing on your own rich experience. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure people will have questions for you when we come to that part of the session. It's now my great pleasure to ask Claire Horton, the Director General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, to make her contribution. Claire, please.
Thank you. Thank you. You probably could hear me anyway. I have a voice that seems to carry quite well. So they tell me. You said something, Dirk, that really struck actually a chord with many of us, and I wanted just to read it out to you all. You said, death in military service is a public death. It's a death on behalf of the state, and therefore the state has some responsibility to that person and to their family by providing them with a permanent grave or memorialisation. The promise never to forget made physical. So today we are exploring how individuals and states benefit from and can use this permanent form of commemoration for peaceful and diplomatic ends. The battlefields have been reclaimed. They've mostly gone. But we're seeing those last remaining veterans disappear. And with that, we worry, will we forget? And Lord Ricketts talked earlier on about young people, and will they forget? Do they remember? Will they be thinking in the future? Does it matter? We did some research about a year ago where we spoke to a large group of young people across the country to really get a sense of what their views were about commemoration. Is it time to draw a line and move on? And yes, there was a group that felt it was important. We just gave up now. Let's just move on. We do this enough. We've done it. It's long done. But the vast majority felt it was important, recognised it was important, wanted to understand more. And there's something there about education, and there's something there about communication. But the important question is how we do it, when we do it, where we do it, how we bring young people, and not just young people, actually wider audiences. Lots of people haven't had that sort of immersion that we've all had into this area. Many people are just seeing remembrance once a year. They'll be seeing ceremonies, and they'll be seeing them again, of course, this year as we commemorate and celebrate VJ days. And there'll be some very public events happening during May and throughout the back end of the summer. So how do we bring the message? How do we use the lessons of the past, that human cost of war, to take forward the learnings for the future? And Lord Ricketts, particularly in his speech, talked about all of the sites, and Peter Hudson talked about how war cemeteries, memorials are used not just for visitors who are visiting family, who are looking to learn about history, but actually they're used by major political figures to visit, to take meetings. The Macron-Modi meeting was important. The Pope coming last year to Rome Cemetery to say a Mass of Peace. Royal visits, on-state visits to cemeteries, memorials. Working with colleagues cross nations, talking about better ways of working together, cooperation, collaboration. All of that's important, and all of that happens in these sites. We'll be seeing the 110th anniversary of Gallipoli in the next month. And leaders from around the world, young people, residents from different countries will all be going across, not just to Gallipoli, but to Anzac ceremonies around the world, where the sacrifice of nations and of the sons and the daughters of nations will be commemorated and remembered. And those ceremonies will be gathering points. There'll be meeting places. There'll be places where people talk about the past. They'll talk about the present. They'll talk about the awful conflicts that we're seeing now. And they'll think about the future. They'll think about how each one of these people that we are there to remember is an individual with a family, with missing dreams, with missing visions, whose ambitions were never realised, whose descendants were never born. Each one is a story, and it points to that top point over there about many stories. It also talks to many voices, not just the lost voices, but the voices of those that remain, our own voices, the duty of all of us to think about how we use commemoration to build better relationships cross borders, cross towns, cross families. It is crucial as a diplomatic tool that we remember, and it's crucial in history as we make new history every day, that we move forward together, that we think about how we work in cooperation, and I am delighted, and we enjoy a really strong and positive relationship with our colleagues in the German War Graves Commission, Belgians, the French. Everywhere across the world there are organisations like us that work to keep the souls of the dead remembered and the learnings of nations at the forefront. And so it is with great pleasure that we welcome you all here today, and I do look forward to more detailed conversations this morning.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. And for, I think we've got Ed on the line, so perhaps I can turn to Dirk Bakken, the General Secretary of the German War Graves Commission next, and then for the last speaker, we'll turn to the Ambassador on the line. Please.
Yes, thank you. The role of commemoration diplomacy, I wouldn't say it's just a role, it's a very important role, and sometimes a significant role, and in many cases, like in Russia, at least at the moment, for Germany, the only role that is left. It derives a little bit from the construction that we have in Germany. We are a private association that is supported by the government and carries out all the work abroad, not inside Germany, but outside in other countries. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is our largest funder, and then that makes it, of course, always a matter of diplomacy by sheer construction. I start with the German Memorial Day. It's the second Sunday before the first Advent in November, right after the Armistice Day. The speaker in the German Bundestag is invited by the Volksbund, not by the President of Germany, though the protocol takes care of everything, but we write the invitation. It's our event. It's broadcasted on TV live, and just a list of speakers gives you an impression how important it is, how it is perceived in the two pillars of diplomacy. And I'm speaking here of not the secret diplomacy that takes place in some back chambers, but it's perceived in the capitals of the countries, and it's perceived in the societies of those countries. So President Macron, Jean-Claude Juncker, now King Charles spoke. Unfortunately, we had those COVID days. There were not many visitors allowed, but his speech was followed by really a huge number of spectators back home and at the TV. The Latvian president, Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden, last year the president of Romania, and this year it'll be the state president of Italy. So, I mean, that list alone gives you an impression how important we see the message that we can send with commemoration, and a proper evaluation, and how much attention we pay, especially on bilateral and multilateral relations. And simply out of my let's say my workshop, the Netherlands, IJsselstein, is a beautiful cemetery. It was constructed by the Americans, and that's the reason why it's beautiful. It's 32,000 war graves. That is what the war took out of human mankind every day. So it's really impressive when you're standing there. The first time I went with my wife last year, I took her to IJsselstein. She broke out in tears. And that means something. Normally, as a soldier's wife, she's used to some things. But the chief rabbi of the Netherlands became a strong, he uttered strong critics, because there was an inscription saying 32,000 German soldiers rest here. Well, that's not the full truth. Most of them were German soldiers, but there were also war criminals, the Allgemeine SS, so not the fighting SS, but those who actually did the torture behind the lines, and of course collaborators. So you cannot just name it 32,000 soldiers. There were other graves as well in significant numbers. So we put up a sign right in the middle of that cemetery. It's a memorial sign for those who were denied a grave. The 106,000 Dutch people, mainly Jews and opposing resistance fighters, you name it. The chief rabbi, Rabbi Jacobs, gave the opening speech. He would have never put a foot on this cemetery without that act of reconciliation. And it made it quite into the newspapers in the public perception of a German gesture. And that is what I simply think is perfect diplomacy. And we did it in, of course, always in good cooperation with our embassies. Cannock Chase, for example, it's the one and only central cemetery here in the United Kingdom. To provide the funds to restore Cannock Chase and to build an educational stronghold there, my argument then in Berlin was, think about the consequences if we don't do it, the diplomatic damage that we do. And that is the reason why I got the money, which is the good news. I work in the German-Polish Commission, and that's a very sensitive commission because Poland suffered quite a lot under German occupation during the Second World War. And taking care of German Jewish soldiers in northern France and taking away the Latin Cross and give them the Star of David obviously gets not much attention in Germany because there's no large Jewish community left in Germany. But the families now live in Israel, they live in the United States, and newspapers are full of those stories when we do that. I'm invited to speak at the congregation in New York this November at the Memorial Day, the United States Memorial Day. I think an event that has never happened. And think about it, I represent the perpetrators, those who were responsible for the Holocaust. I think that is breaking ice here, what we do. The Franco-German relations have been mentioned, and topics of commemoration often make it to the agenda of the Franco-German Council of Ministers. And of course, this is a masterpiece, a kind of blueprint how commemoration can contribute to reconciliation. We still have to be aware that there are diplomatic issues. For example, the occupied areas of France, the Alsatian area and Lotharingia, we recruited soldiers there during the Second World War. And those were still, in a legal sense, French citizens. So that was a war crime. And to restore, let's say, those who were drafted against their will, it requires some action. The desire is to put up signs in all our cemeteries in France and in the East, because most of them died in the East, saying, here rest malgré nous, so that those who were drafted against their will. But the truth is, maybe, and we don't have the exact numbers, but let's say 95% definitely were drafted against their will. But what about the 5% who volunteered? Do we put a coat of honor on them where there is no reason to do so? So it's a very diplomatic question, and there are representatives from the Assemblée Nationale who approach us, and we have to do that. We are a mediator on diplomatic issues between South Korea and Japan, right in the middle of Germany, because it's about putting up monuments to commemorate the, I don't know how you say in English, the comfort women, and those who actually were abused during the Japanese operations in Korea. And it is a diplomatic issue. I personally had to talk to the ambassador, to the general consul, and it requires what we call diplomatic sensitivity and also cultural competence. You have to understand that how you look at things does not necessarily mean that they look at the same thing in the same way. It might hurt their feelings when you think this is a just idea. And the last thing, of course, is Russia. We still work in Russia. I have 30 folks employed in Russia. I have a leader with his office in Moscow. He is in constant contact with the Russian government, especially with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I probably would say, even if it is difficult right now, it's the only thing that is still working. And we still recover Red Army soldiers in Germany each year, and we provide them a proper grave in Germany. And the Russian ambassador is invited, but the Russian ambassador is not allowed to give a speech in front of a camera, TV camera, because he will misuse this land, of course. We know this, because their idea of commemoration is something else. It's a narrative that explains why everything, even the war in Ukraine, is justified. So there are open tasks I have a lot of things on the bucket list. Our colonial past is something that is underdeveloped, I must say this. And sometimes the capitals think they can pay it with money, like, for example, what we did in Namibia. So there was an agreement how to finish this, but does this really satisfy, let's say, the hurt feelings? Does it satisfy the families? I don't think so. I think we should go there. We should look for the Herero graves in the desert. That is what we could do, and I'm still offering this. And I hope someday I will see this happen. So, cultural competence, it's a prerequisite for good diplomacy, and commemoration has a significant and important role in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dirk, for that very impressive and moving contribution to our discussion. And of course, the history of Germany is very bound up with the history of our country through the two terrible wars of the last century. So very important to hear all the work you've been doing. And I think the last link you made to Africa and the your colonial past is something which perhaps we can reflect on further in discussion with the South African High Commissioner. But before we throw it open to questions, I think we have Ambassador Ed Llewellyn joining us from Rome, I believe, Ed.
Buongiorno tutti. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me over there.
Perfectly. Please go ahead.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Lovely to be joining you, if only remotely, this morning from Rome. And much of what I will say will be very familiar to Peter Ricketts, because we both served as ambassador in France. But maybe I can just give a few reflections on how I see the role of commemoration in diplomacy, having been for 5 years ambassador in France, and now for the last 3 years ambassador here in Italy and San Marino, and before that my time in Downing Street. I would just make a few points. I mean, I think the first thing to say is I see the role of commemoration in diplomacy as both relating to the country in which one is operating, but also back home to the UK. And let me just say a word about the UK-facing part first. I have sort of taken the view, both when I was in Paris and now here in Rome, that it's very important that people back home should see that their diplomats and their ambassadors are honouring the fallen. And I think we owe it to our own country to do that as representatives of the government in the country in which we're serving. I think it plays an important role as well in with our young people and demonstrating that the fallen are not forgotten. But I feel quite strongly that there is a sort of, there is a duty on the behalf of the country's diplomatic representatives today to demonstrate back home that, their sons, or in most cases now, grandsons and great-grandsons and granddaughters are remembered and are being remembered by our country's representatives overseas. So, for example, here in Italy, I am attempting to, with my team, to visit all 120 6 Commonwealth War Grave sites across Italy during my time as ambassador. When I announced this objective, I'd slightly underestimated the scale of the task involved, not with respect to what one thinks of as Commonwealth War Graves cemetery, of which there are around 50 spread across Italy, but of course the individual graves, many of them in far-flung municipal cemeteries, some of them up mountainsides, literally solitary gravestones of a British Commonwealth soldier that are actually quite hard to reach and quite hard to identify. But I think, 80 years after the end of the Second World War, I think I feel it's quite important that every one of those sites should be visited. So I hope to do that in my time. With respect to France, as Peter will remember, during my time as ambassador there, we worked very closely together on the Normandy, British Normandy Memorial, which again was important above all for our veterans and for their families, but of course plays now a very important role in our diplomatic relationship with France, as we saw last summer at the anniversary of D-Day. I remember speaking to President Macron within a fortnight of him taking office about that memorial, which we were getting underway at the time, and I saw him in his office, and I said to him, Mr. President, we're going to need your help with this. And he looked me in the eye and he said, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, nous le ferons. And he was absolutely true to his word, and it became a very important example of Franco-British cooperation over some years in which the Franco-British relationship was going through a difficult time in other areas, but we absolutely worked together on that to recognise the shared sacrifice of our countries. I try, both in France and now here, to, as it were, bring these commemorations and this act of commemoration to life with particular examples. For example, in France, I remember going with the current Defence Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, to his constituency, which was in which the French resistance was very prominent, and Sébastien felt, and I know feels very strongly about the role of commemoration in national life. But it was a good example of us using, I think, commemoration in diplomacy to keep memories alive. To go back to Italy, again here, we've been marking, of course, over the last couple of years, the 80th anniversary of the Italian campaign. And I'm very struck here, as I was in France, that at every one of these ceremonies I go to, there are a very large number of young children present, which is very much a feature of commemoration in both France and Italy. But I try to look for ways of bringing these anniversaries to life. For example, when it comes to the anniversary of the Anzio landings here, we managed to get the ship of which Peter Hudson was previously the captain, HMS Albion, to visit Anzio in the run-up to the commemoration in 2023, and her landing craft came into the port of Anzio the first time the British landing craft had entered that port since January 1944. The entire town turned out, and there was a very moving commemoration on the jetty of the Anzio landings. And that was a good example, I think, of both diplomacy, our armed forces, the local community, the Italian state working together to bring an act of commemoration to life. I similarly remember with a very well-known, and now sadly he's left us, British veteran here, Harry Schindler, who'd lived in Italy for the last 40 years. He landed at Anzio, and I remember Harry in the last year of his life, we went to Anzio together, and for the last commemoration, he asked me to deliver the speech on his behalf at the Anzio commemoration, and I had this rather surreal scene of delivering a speech for Harry as he was watching me over an iPhone from his flat the other side of Italy in Porto d'Ascoli, because he'd sadly had a fall and wasn't able to make it. But Harry's presence and the presence of those veterans, as we all know, of course in dwindling number, have such an enormous impact on the local communities and the local commemorations. Lastly, I think it's important to work with, particularly in France and Italy, in my experience, with the local communities and the local histories. So, for example, in France, though this was working with people who were still alive, but the fact that for the 80th anniversary of de Gaulle's appel, Britain awarded honours to the 4 surviving Compagnons de la Libération. That was a very important signal, and I know enormously appreciated in France, and helped to bring the whole issue of commemoration to the fore. Likewise, here in Italy, we had for the 80th anniversary of Monte Cassino last year, a surviving British veteran came, John Hearn made the journey all the way from the UK, and watching him interact with local school kids at the Monte Cassino cemetery was incredibly moving. By the same token, I have made a point of going to see in northern Italy Italian SOE veteran, Paola Deldin, who in a couple of weeks, it will be the 80th anniversary since 80th anniversary of her jump from a British aircraft, having been parachute trained near Udine. And the fact that the UK remembers her and has not forgotten her makes an enormous difference here, remembering, of course, her other resistant comrades who made the ultimate sacrifice. Lastly, you may have seen that in a few weeks' time, the King and Queen will be visiting Italy. Others have referred to the role of the royal family in commemoration, which of course is preeminent. But the King will be visiting, when he comes to Italy, Ravenna. And at Ravenna, when you go into the town hall there, they have had, since 1946, the British and Canadian flags on either side of the town hall, commemorating the role of particularly British and Canadian, but also of Allied forces in liberating that town. And their Majesties will be visiting on the 80th anniversary and to the day of the liberation of that particular province. A good example of the role of diplomacy in commemoration. So those are a few reflections, seriatim fashion, and I'll hand back to London, as they say.
Ambassador. Ambassador Llewellyn, thank you so much for that. Some really interesting thoughts for us. We're now going to throw it open to questions. I think on the panel we're bathed in sunlight, so I'm not sure we can always see all the questions, so be patient if I don't call you straight away. There is a microphone, I think, going around, so if you can wait for that to arrive, then that'd be much appreciated. And do introduce who you are when you speak. Now, I think I've got somebody here, please. Here, at the back. It's a crowded room, so it takes a while for microphones to arrive.
Hello, good morning.
Could you stand up?
Stand up. My name's Amir Pedasoli. I'm a student at King's College, just up the road in Strand, and I had a question touching on the role that the GWC has in political narratives, because, as I can see, I'm on the younger side of the room here, and emerging on social media a lot of far-right narratives, especially involving the sacrifice made by the soldiers. And I just wanted to ask if educational institutions and the CWG have a role in countering these narratives, which I believe are influencing a lot of young people our age.
Great question. Thank you very much. Claire, would you like to take that one?
We spend a lot of time talking on social media about the work that we do all over the world. We are thinking long and hard about how best to work with younger audiences and how we work between the platforms that they operate on, because lots of less traditional news sources now for them than there ever were before, and we have to be able to keep up. Someone asked earlier on about digital competencies and how do you address people, how do you work with people. We talk about peace. We talk about stories of individual people, contributions. We don't get political, if I can say that. That's not our role. But we set context for conflict and the environment that conflict grows in. We talk about the contributions, the bravery, the loss, the sacrifice of all of those people and the impact it has back to their communities. And I guess by doing that, what we're trying to do is to showcase the importance of, one, there is something around, I suppose, about loyalty and service and sacrifice for your fellow man. And that's important in there too, and I think that's implicit in there. And it's about, I guess, what that engenders in people. Does it engender pride? Does it engender awareness? Does it engender anger? Do people push back on that? And yes, of course they do. There's lots of that. But it's how you then take that narrative forward in a way, and I think we heard so well today from really from the German perspective and from Dirk, actually how hard it is, and we feel this here in the UK, how hard it is to battle with your past, whilst recognising that it's a history we have to own and we have to talk about and we have to build on, and sometimes we apologise for that, and sometimes we have to be proud of that, and it's how do you balance that with future audiences so that the messages are real, true and honest, to allow people to make up their own minds. I'm sorry, that's a bit rambling, but I guess it kind of gives you a bit of a sense of the responsibility I think we feel to the messaging.
Now, I'm not planning to ask all our speakers to respond to each question because we have lots of questions, but if the speakers do want to add something, then please do come in. And for Ed and Beatrice, if you want to raise your virtual hand, if you ever want to come into a particular question, then do so, and I'll endeavour to call you. Right, I think we have a gentleman in the front row here now.
Thank you very much, Gerald Allison. Could I just say how valuable I think this discussion has been today to talk about these topics on an international basis with such a wide audience and distinguished speakers is marvellous. But my question is to ask a point that's been picked up by Lord Ricketts and by Dirk, and that is about civilian casualties of conflict, which has really been the story of more recent years and, of course, is the story of today. Do you think the power of commemoration would be greater if we gave greater weight to civilian losses?
Well, what an interesting question, and perhaps more than one member of the panel will want to take that on. Beatrice, is this something you'd be prepared to start on?
Okay, thank you very much. I do have a thought on this. Yes, I think it would be good, and yes, this leads to this whole question area of how responsible civilians are for the acts of their governments, or whether they are actually all the victims of this. But I think we should stick with the international legal laws of war, laws of armed conflict definition, which of course takes the non-combatants out of the category of being directly involved in war. And from the point of view of commemorating those who sort of died from bombardments, etc., I think that is probably a very good idea. As Malcolm alluded to the fact that it was significant that I was in Hamburg. Hamburg, of course, had these great casualties in the Second World War, where particularly the workers' quarters were bombed. And it's a very complex situation because, or a very complex story, because there's a fantastic exhibition in the basement of one of the churches here in Hamburg, which shows how the Nazi leadership actually tried to prepare their population for this bombardment, assuming that the population was going to go along with it and not protest in any way, and prepared them with horrible little things like they had a sort of monopoly game of how best in your house to withstand bombing, how you had to clear the attic because there's lots of things that can burn in the attic, and how you should prepare for this event to happen. And there was no protest, etc., in the population. So it's a complex story, but I think retrospectively, again, it comes back to this idea that everybody has the right to be mourned, and that civilians as well as soldiers who died in war should be regretted for that reason. Thank you.
Anybody else from the panel on this? Yeah, Ed, please.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just say I think it's a very, very important point. But and I think increasingly. Well, not necessarily perhaps increasingly, but at the sort of commemorations I've been referring to, the sacrifices of the civilian population are, and quite properly, should be remembered. I'm thinking, that's the case at Anzio, at Monte Cassino, where there were obviously enormous civilian casualties. The big commemorative events make a point of commemorating civilian casualties as well, and of course at the British Normandy Memorial as well there is a particular French memorial to French sacrifice, which is part of that memorial. I think it is extremely important.
High Commissioner, please.
No, I think it's an important point. We need to, as we said, not leave anybody behind. However, we also need to put it within context. And if I recall, this has a historical context in that it comes out of recognizing those people who were involved in the two wars, for example, to commemorate them and to celebrate them. Now it's expanded. It's no longer just a British initiative. I don't know, I'm sure Claire and them would have much to say about all this. It has involved other countries which, in a what you call way, make also contribution towards commemorating this. And so I think the point is correct. We need to find a creative way in which you can involve, a way in which you recognize how to commemorate civilians, which are plenty, they are everywhere in the entire world, everybody has suffered. How do you do that, taking into account the historical context? I think something that you need to evolve into slowly, also bearing in mind, I would say, the resources that you have. and make sure that if you do that, then you recognize all the civilians that had suffered. It's a huge endeavor which we need to undertake, but slowly and getting into it.
Very good, thank you. Right, let's see who else. My goodness. Right, let's stick to this chap here.
Thank you very much indeed. Eddie O'Sullivan. I'm son of a Second World War veteran, and my mother served in the ATS in the old War Office in 1945 when the message came that the war was over. I'm also Vice Chairman of the Rome-based non-profit initiative called Freedom for Italy, and we are working with the Italian government at the national, regional and local level to ensure the experiences of Italy at that period are not forgotten. And I would like to thank Ambassador Ed Llewellyn for outstanding work that he's done in supporting this initiative. He really is leaving a mark. I want to thank your team, Claire. Gareth, I can see supporting us, and Claudia and Giordano, your team in Rome, who've been tremendous supporters. Dirk, you hope don't mind me calling you Dirk, I'm Eddie. Can I thank you for the support I got last year from your colleague Maria Van Ungen and her team, who allowed a British delegation to attend your memorial event in Cairo and to have Irish bagpipers for the first time to play at that ceremony for your team and the ambassador. And I would like to thank also Ambassador Mambo for the work of your colleague, Colonel Mankai, in the South African Embassy in Rome, because we're working together to make sure that the contribution to the peace that came in 1945, made by the people of South Africa and Southern Africa, white, African and mixed race, we're trying to encompass them all. So my question, there is a question here, and it's to Dirk and Claire. And I visited dozens of the and Commonwealth cemeteries, and not just in Europe, but also in the Far East. And I've also had the very moving experience of standing in the Cairo Cemetery, maintained by your organisation, Dirk. How are you tracking the number of people who are visiting your cemeteries? How do you do that? And what are the trends? Is the trend going up? Are more people visiting your cemeteries? Is the trend going down? And if the trend is going down, perhaps you could share with us what both your organisations are doing. And I've been in contact with the French War Graves Commission as well as the Polish Cemetery Commission as well. What ideas can you share with us, the ideas that your organisations might have to stimulate more visiting to your cemeteries now that the eyewitnesses of the war have gone?
Perfect. That's the question for Dirk and Claire. Dirk.
Yeah, very good question. Honestly, we don't track all visitors on all our sites, but we do track visitors on some prominent sites. For example, La Combe in Normandy, we know each year there are about 300,000, 400,000 visitors. Many of them, I'd say most of them, non-Germans. If you go to the grave of Michael Wittmann, one of the most successful tankers in the Second World War, Waffen-SS soldier, notably, you find a lot of poppies there. That somehow irritates us occasionally, I must say. But if you look a little bit further, this guy was never a war criminal. He was just a fighting tanker. And that is probably recognized, but it's better recognized outside of Germany than inside of Germany. So there are places, especially where we have erected exhibitions, then of course we track the visitors. And I'd say it's difficult. For example, you go to Maleme on Crete. It's a beautiful place. Many visitors, many tourists, also a British role there on Crete. When you put up a new exhibition, more visitors come. So we have to look at, let's say, in the long run, how many will come. But exhibitions and educational enhancements always raise the numbers of visitors. We've done this on other war cemeteries in Normandy, and we have seen an increase of people coming. Yeah.
Great. Claire?
Much the same, so ditto to that. But what I would add is we're working all over the world in key locations with local agencies, with local organisations, with regional and national governments and authorities on heritage tourism, and that's very much about local authorities wanting to ensure that there's inward investment, that there are visitors coming to their local areas, that their economy is being boosted, that there's employment, that there's education and opportunity. For us, what we see is visitors will come and we can then work with those visitors through information at the sites that they're visiting, context panels, and the online digital apps that we have to help them think about what a forward journey might be, a plan of different sites. So we also have visitor centres, and we've got a great relationship with so for example on the Western Front with the Western Front Way, where we are trying collectively to work together to encourage people who are interested in cycling or walking across France, and particularly along that Western Front, to follow that trail and to visit local cemeteries, sites that we have, as well as local hostelries and bed and breakfasts and what have you. So there is a thing about partnership and how we work together. And in terms of visitor numbers, I was, Peter Ricketts was talking about 250,000 people coming to the Normandy Memorial, 400,000 visiting the Menin Gate. We have a presence in both of those places. We have a roving exhibition at the moment called Every Name Forevermore. We just launched it a couple of weeks ago in Portcullis House, where we have 600,000 names of all those who died in the Second World War. All of those names are on an exhibition, huge panel, and you can literally look at the names. You need your glasses, but you can do that. And it's how you engage people thereafter. So that's got to be about not only getting people who are going to the sites, but taking the sites to people.
Perfect, Claire. Right, Ed, you wanted to come in.
I'm afraid I just wanted to come in to say that I'm afraid I've got to skip off, but thank you very much for having me. Apologies for having to leave a bit early, and I hope the rest of the conference goes very well.
Not at all, but we very much appreciate the fact that you've taken time in your busy schedule to join us and made a real contribution to our discussion, I think. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Right, we have a gentleman just there. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Eddie Smythe, and I've got a question for Madam Heuser, if you don't mind. Some of the comments you made really resonated with me. The football slogan, 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, and most of us would have seen that infamous episode on Fawlty Towers, don't mention the war. There's this kind of sort of mocking approach to the war and to the Germans and the role they played. My father was in the RAF during the Second World War. He was shot down over Germany, and he was captured and spent 18 months in a prison of war camp, Stalag Luft 1. Now, last year I was invited to visit the location of the prison of war camp by a group of Germans who strive to preserve the memory of the war camp. Now, when I got there, it's all beautiful fields, beautiful walks, but they have plinths all along the walks with QR codes so you can scan them. It takes you to pictures of the camps and all the awful things that happened. And in May this year, they're celebrating 80 years of the end of the war, and there's a large event. Relatives are being invited of prisoners, mainly Americans, it has to be said, and I've been invited to give a talk at this event. Now, what I found, certainly with all the Germans that I interacted with, was this sort of acceptance of the role played by their country. There's a sort of refreshing honesty about it all. You know, we must never forget what we did. We must remind all our folk what we did. And I just wonder how we can sort of replicate that feeling in this country, and we can move away from sort of the trivializing of it and that mocking approach which you mentioned. I think it'll be really refreshing if we could do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Beatrice, perhaps you could start.
Just briefly, I must say that I think the Fawlty Towers episode has actually been seen by very many Germans, and I think it has actually educated a lot of people to a slightly different approach, and they've relaxed a bit, and a lot of them found it funny. I do think, however, that if it goes to a higher level, more official level, this is why I was referring to the commemoration of Trafalgar. There is at some stage you can play along with the mockery, you can play along with all sorts of things, but there's one bit where you can't really expect people to celebrate with you your victory over, the other group. And this is why I'm simply cautioning against doing that on a very high level. As I said, there's a lot of camaraderie, and it's very odd. I'm actually working with a lot of German officers now. And there is one who has been very British socialised, and he keeps taking the mickey out of me, and I know that it's fun, and it's like the British interaction with British armed forces. Whereas the others wouldn't understand that. So there's some and others. You have to be careful not to think that the entire foreign culture you're dealing with can understand British humour immediately. Some have been socialised to do so, and I personally think the faulty cows thing is very. I remember the first time I saw it, and I was sort of taken aback a bit. But I think it's educated a lot of people. But don't assume that this is something that you find everywhere, that you find total acceptance for.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come into that? Dirk, did you want to come in on this?
Sometimes things become tradition. Having served for more than a decade under the auspices of a British Corps commander in Germany, and having been with General Jackson on the Kosovo campaign, I must say I have quite an insight of, let's say, our bilateral military relations. And I have been a guest to many Waterloo nights. And somehow it's strange for us, because then we were on the good side, on the right side. I enjoyed it very much, I must say. But of course, it is an event still, though it is carried out with pleasure, with humor, and with a lot of fun. There's a grain of, let's say, deeper story behind it. It's about that nations and they combine to an alliance when it is necessary. And that's a beautiful story, I guess. Yeah, when you have an aggression and then you can only fight that aggression together. Actually, the message is a message that we need today. Yeah, we see that we have a new aggression in the East. I agree with Beatrice that it very much depends on where you are. So there is a circle that definitely can absolutely cope with the way you commemorate, and I personally have absolutely no objections. But we all know the situation that we meet someone on the street or even in our parliaments who asks you the question, what are you doing there? Yeah? Who have no access to the whole thing. And that is something where you have to think about the narrative that you use. Why are you doing this? And especially what I take away from our international meetings with other organizations is that there is a kind of common ground that we all share, which is a pretty good reason. Sometimes I convince my own government better with arguments from the former enemy than with my own, I say. So we cannot give up war cemeteries in France because it's an insult to France if we do this. Yeah? And your own cemeteries, imagine this, no German war cemetery at all. Would it be the same on your cemeteries? I don't think so. So if you want to understand war in total, especially in educational matters, you should go and visit cemeteries from all sides, yeah, to see, and then combine it to a larger picture. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Peter, did you want? No. Okay. Right. Let me see. Goodness, quite a few now. Why don't we go for the gentleman in the middle first?
David Williams, until very recently the president of the King's African Rifles and East African Forces Association. Claire, as the Director General, would you like to say something about the positive steps that you have taken to address the points that the Defence Secretary apologised in the House of Commons a few years ago for the inadequate commemoration of war dead from Africa, especially in the First World War?
Yes, thank you. I'd be delighted. We launched a programme 4 years ago. We've just completed 4 years. It's called our Non-Commemorations Programme, and it addresses failings of the Commission over 100 years ago to commemorate many either non-combatants or carriers, labourers, others from large parts of Africa, India, Middle East. In the last 4 years, we have worked extensively looking for names, looking for histories, trying to understand, find those locations of people we missed. We have, the High Commissioner kindly mentioned earlier on the most recent memorial that the Commission has built and inaugurated in South Africa. That is the Cape Town Labour Corps Memorial, which commemorates 1,700 carriers, labourers from South Africa. And that was a very beautiful memorial, real collaborative piece where we worked very closely with colleagues all around the world, but certainly the South African and Cape Town authorities. We were doing a lot of work in Kenya. We're looking at our colleagues here from the Punjab registers. We are looking for huge number, up to 10,000 names, we think, that will make up that sort of Punjab registers that we will be commemorating. We have adopted memorials that are all in existence. We've done work in Malawi. We are about to build a memorial in Sierra Leone, in Freetown. We're working, I will stress, this is all work being done with local communities, with local authorities, with National Museums of Kenya, for example, to address the failed commemorations. And how is it being received? Really productively, really positively, and real collaboration and partnership. We've found descendants, we've run programmes around oral histories, we've secured most recently the oral testimony of the last surviving sort of Second World War veterans in Africa. We've done work with King's African Rifles, we've digitised almost the entire Kenyan Defence Force records. The only place we are struggling to get into is the archives. I think we visited every archive under the sun. Our researchers are all here today and done an amazing job. I think the only struggle we're having is to get into the archives in Egypt. So if anybody has any way to help us do that, we would be delighted to talk to you. So that a little ask there. But it is an extensive programme. If anybody's interested in looking at the detail of it, go onto the website. We publish a quarterly report every 12 weeks to both Parliament and to the Secretary of State and to the wider public. And we also publish an annual report. The fourth annual report is all but ready now to be published in the next week, I suspect. So it's been extensive, but it's been hugely important and very well received indeed. A great piece of work that we're very proud of.
Perfect. Did you want to add anything on this? No. Okay. And we in fact, I chaired an event maybe about 3 years ago with David Lanny, who was raising this particular issue in relation to East Africa when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary. Right. Gentleman here. You had?
Thank you. Nick Westcott, now Sarah's former diplomat. It was just to follow up that last point. The diplomatic implications of commemoration is more complicated in former colonies. And so I'm very pleased to hear that answer. But High Commissioner Mambola, I was very pleased with your words as well. Perhaps you could say a little more. There was the role of the royals is important in this context. Prince Philip visited Ghana while I was there. We had a commemoration service. He made a big effort to talk to the veterans of the Burma campaign, who were still alive then, to thank them for their service to Britain. And one of them said, "Sir," he said, "I didn't do this for Britain. I did this for the King. He needed my help, and I gave it.
Thank you.
That's very true.
Let's just take a couple more, and then we'll come back to the panel. Please, the chat next.
Hello, my name is Kevin Baisley. I'm the Deputy Memorial Officer for Fighting with Pride, and we're currently delivering the National LGBT Armed Forces Community Memorial at the National Arboretum as part of the Lord Etherton Review. Part of that process that we've gone through is quite an extensive consultation period with the veterans who were impacted by the LGBT ban, but also the current serving LGBT personnel in the armed forces. And we found that really, really helpful, obviously. I was wondering if the panel could say how important you think a consultation period is, both obviously in the design of the memorial, but actually in the diplomacy and the education and so on that follows.
Super. Thank you. Who would like to take that?
Well,
Claire,
I'm sorry, speaking a lot, I'll do it really quickly. I think it's really critical. Certainly, based on the previous answer that we were talking about in our own work, we develop and build new memorials. If you're not talking to the relevant stakeholder groups, all of them, not just the relevant parties affected, but those wider ministries around them, the wider actors, it's an under. You're not going to do the right thing by both the memorial or the people you're trying to commemorate. And we're delighted to be working with you on that memorial. So and John's at the back there. I saw him earlier. We're really pleased to help support anything you like. But certainly, in anything we do, consultation is critical because you're going to get those cultural sensitivities right, and that's really important, as we found particularly in any of the non-commemorations work we've done. And you're going to test the temperature of the water and the public appetite, so you're able to do the right thing around your messaging and your communications too.
Perfect. Right. Who else have we got? Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Felix Gedney. I'm a soldier. First of all, thank you to the panel for wonderful comments and insight. And I'm left thinking from Professor Beatrice's comments about Trafalgar, the extent to which we should be commemorating the outcome of conflicts rather than remembering those that fell. But my question relates to the extent to which we should be exploiting remembrance for, as it says in front of me, a valued instrument for diplomacy and influence. And is there a risk that could diminish the relative simplicity of a memorial to those that fell?
That's an excellent question. Who would like to... Beatrice has volunteered, please.
Very much so. So thank you very much. I think a brilliant question because it takes me back to the point that I made at the beginning, that we can always, we should always be able to come together over mourning, the regret for the lives wasted, etc. The outcome itself can be problematic. And if you just think about it, together with a friend, we edited a wonderful series of books, two-volume books, which is on famous battles and how they influence politics. Because battles since Pericles' speech and the Peloponnesian War have been used to drive home a point about sacrifice for the community, but also about, the gods are with us, success in battle, or if you die in battle, then perhaps it's just a sort of Christ-like sacrifice, and all this sort of stuff. And for centuries, battles have been used for political programs. Particularly when the winning party was usually tried to somehow instill coming generations into with the sense of sacrifice for the sake of those wonderful people who'd fought in the past and done something with it. So it's a very dangerous area because battles have been abused horribly over time for political agendas. And from that point of view, thank you for addressing this issue. The question is always where do you go? And I think Trafalgar and Waterloo. Basically, if you go to Waterloo in Belgium, you realise there's clearly Napoleon who won because there's far more literature and far more about Napoleon than about anybody else. So that becomes a bit of a joke. And I think that there were enough times around 2015 that you had French politicians that are writing little articles saying actually Napoleon won because of the coup de Napoleon and the inheritance of the French Revolution, republicanism, etc., human rights have actually prevailed. So, there are bits that can be used in that way, and even with Trafalgar, I think one could easily take it with more levity, shall we say. But the important thing is that you might not find this for very recent conflicts, and that you might find it infinitely worse and much more difficult, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in areas where conflict is still very hot and where the embers are still glowing, the ashes are still glowing. Particularly if you try to go to the Balkans or something like that. If you go to Bosnia, I mean, the conflict's still there. If you go to Kosovo, the conflict's still there. So don't have an illusion about what you can do with this in order to settle conflicts that are still ongoing.
Right, let's move on to the next question. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. Suvena Kama, Fiji's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. My Prime Minister is actually putting together with the leaders of the Pacific a declaration for the Pacific to become a zone of peace. It is the Pacific's contribution towards peace. And in doing so, there's been requests by families who have their families buried in Commonwealth graves around the world, especially in the Pacific, in Papua New Guinea, to be actually retrieved and returned to Fiji, so that it comes together with that we want to be useful for peace, that slogan. So my question is that in terms of the Commonwealth war graves, what is the process by which we could actually do this and let that voice that resonate in the Commonwealth be also resonate in the Pacific Island countries? Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I think that's a question for Claire.
Thank you. It's a long and detailed process, and one we're very happy to talk to you about, and I think, in fact, we are already talking to you about. There is just a point that I would like to make, and it isn't at all, notwithstanding what you're saying, there is something, it almost relates to the previous question, where there is something about these silent cities, and it was a question about do you sort of lose the value if you have a stage for diplomacy, and I don't think you do. I think what you have is in these larger cemeteries where you have these concentrations of huge numbers of war graves and huge memorials with tens of thousands of names on. There is something that affects the soul when you visit that impacts in the way that people perceive the impact of war, and that doesn't diminish anything. It actually increases and perpetuates the ability for us to remember. Now what I see is in the UK we have 170,000 scattered graves. Lots of them are in individual plots, and they're lost. We've got signs on cemeteries, but they're lost. They're there, people may visit, may not visit. We'll look after them, and we have a great volunteer group that help us with that. But if all of these millions of graves were lost like that and all scattered around the world, would we feel as we do now? Would we see as we do? Would we be all sitting here as we do, thinking about the scale of loss that we've experienced over our respective histories? Or is it the fact that they're concentrated in these vast swathes of land in beautiful surroundings, these peaceful memorial gardens and these wonderful places where you reflect and you learn? Is it not that helps perpetuate memory? So it sort of plays to the High Commissioner's question, and I'm very happy to pick the conversation up outside, sir. But it also plays perhaps to a wider question about why we have these concentrated sites.
A very interesting observation, and thankfully we have more time this afternoon to talk about that and other questions. We've got the lady here.
My name is Nadine. I studied Masters in International Relations from the University of Portsmouth. And the question I have is, whilst you've answered and that different nations have different perspectives on their contributions, as we are telling the histories of these people that have undergone, these soldiers lost lives, are you thinking about the future? Because there are challenges that you're facing in telling the narratives in order to ensure there's diplomatic cooperation between these nations. Now, I'm sure there's a lot going on telling those stories that have happened. But now there are stories that are unfolding. What are you doing? What are the the challenges? What have you learned from the challenges that you're implementing now that will ensure that there's safety in the digitalization of the stories that you tell when you do tell it in the future, because we're looking ahead?
Who would like to take that? Dirk, please.
If I got it right, it's about building the bridge from the past to the present and into the future. Sometimes it's a very sober answer. And I talked already last night to Claire about this. I met a gentleman in Lausanne-Gonelle when we had this wonderful event there with the extension of the cemetery, who asked the question afterwards during the reception, are we prepared to do it again? Are we prepared to do it again? What about future war cemeteries? Can we expect them? Not the old ones. Honestly, I think all our nations are not pretty well prepared for this. And we are currently working with the Ministry of Defense on at least setting up some basic capabilities for it. And the Volksbund, of course, because of his expertise, is a first-class partner of the Ministry of Defense. Well, if you're not prepared, you're overwhelmed by the events in case it happens. So that is the very practical side of it. On the other hand, I believe there are always docking points for whoever comes. And I just want to highlight this was one example. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I went to Oksbøl, which is in Denmark, western coast, Northern Sea. Beautiful place, a lot of campers, beaches, marvelous. There's a German war cemetery, mainly German soldiers, 10%, 90% refugees that came over the Baltic Sea and tried during the evacuation operation when the Red Army approached. Heartbreaking stories. There are children that actually died from all the suffering they had experienced during the flight. There was a youth camp we organized, the Volksbund organized, and I met a 20-year-old guy from Syria. And I asked him bluntly, I said, what on earth are you doing here on a German war grave from the war cemetery from the Second World War? And what's your background? And he said he came in 2015 with a large wave of refugees into Germany. And he told me about the very traumatic experience he had as a youngster seen during this horrible tour from Syria. And he said, there's war back home in my country, and I cannot go back. I cannot work with what war does to people, but you give me an option to do this. And that's why I'm here. And he later even became what we call a teamer. So he took German youngsters into the camp and worked with them. So I think there are issues that are timeless and that are not restricted to nations or countries or regions. It's about what do people do in war and what does war do with people. And those stories are timeless. And I think that is where you can always find a connection from the past to today. In Ukraine, where Ukrainian soldiers built trenches to fight and defend their country, and they discovered that it was a trench that was already built by the Wehrmacht when 43, 44, and they discovered bodies inside that trench and gave us back, of course, the remnants with military honors. Yeah. And there are stories that actually can be combined, and we use that also to remember those who fight for our freedom now, and are somewhere nameless at the Ukrainian-Russian front. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for that answer. Right, who else have we got? Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much indeed. Robert Walter. One of my roles is that I chair a prize jury, European prize jury, for a joint venture of two organizations, the European Security and Defense Association and a French organization, CIDAN, Civisme, Défense, Armée, Nation. And our prizes are basically awarded for organizations, civil society organizations, who link the public to the concepts of security and defense. One of our categories is remembrance. And Dirk may remember, I think in 2023, we awarded the Volksbund a prize at the Berlin Security Conference, where we present our prizes. The Western Front Way has received a prize. Just last year, we gave a prize to the Escape Lines Memorial Society. My question is this. There are many organizations involved in commemoration. How well do you work together, and is there scope for better cooperation?
Claire.
Yes, I'd say always scope for better. We work well with those that we have shared projects with or we know, and I've mentioned actually Western Front Way earlier on, which was a relatively new relationship for us about three years ago. I think a lot of it is about priorities and capacity. So, whatever you're working on at this point in time, you will work with whatever partners are the most appropriate, and you come together. We talked earlier on about what we're doing with you, and we're working with others on different memorials. But I am a big believer in partnership working, collaboration. I think that makes for success. Always. We're always better together. So I think we all should and in our case do look for opportunity to collaborate better with people and see how that we make sure that everybody's interests are balanced properly and everybody's contributions are taken seriously. So no, I think it's critical.
Right, we're now maybe one last question, please.
Thank you. I'm Sue Liebird from the British West India Regiment's Heritage Trust. And I was just reflecting in terms of some of the, obviously, dialogue and the conversations that we've been having. And General Secretary Bacon, you used the term cultural competence as a necessity for commemorative diplomacy. How might we get cultural competence then as business as usual, as opposed to something that's an add-on or that is a little bit clunky for us in terms of our thinking? How do we make it business as usual?
I mean, geez, if I knew this, I probably would. I would probably not have this job, but you're absolutely right. It's a necessity, and especially we not only foster youth programs with German youngsters. All our international groups are composed of youngsters from all over Europe, from Israel, from North Africa, of course, the travel is always an issue. And if you put 20 young Europeans together, and I count the Mediterranean area to that, though it's not Europe, but if you put them together and send them 14 days, a fortnight on a tour, and let them experience and discover our very violent history in Europe, you get a different kind of personality out of this. Not by visiting those places, but by interacting between them. And that is what actually makes it happen. I met a German young man who participated in a tour through, and it went through the Baltic states and then through Poland, and they met Lech Walesa and all that kind of stuff. He said, I never thought about the way the Latvians think about the Second World War. I learned a lot. And this is something you cannot learn from history books. You have to meet people from that country. Yeah? The stories that are told in their families, how they perceived it, that the grandfather was taken away from their family, but not by the Germans, but by the Red Army, because they conquered the country first in 1939, something that is totally out of our focus, for example. And then all of a sudden, history becomes kind of adjusted, so that it very much depends on the point of view, where you stand and from what country and from what culture you are. And I think the best thing you can do is just put those people together and let them talk. Yeah?
What a great way to end the morning. Can I start by thanking you all for your engagement in what's a 2.5-hour session without a break, and very impressive. We can congratulate ourselves, and can I thank our fantastic panellists, Beatrice and Ed included, for the way in which they made some really interesting contributions, made some fascinating points. And can I thank actually the questioners? I mean, I think wonderful questions from all of you, and I think it reflects the fact we've got a room here full of people who are living this business in their own personal ways, and ways in which commemoration is something which the Commonwealth War Graves Commission plays a key role, as does its counterpart organisations in Germany and elsewhere. But it's really important that there's a much larger number of volunteers who are involved in their own way because of their own personal experience in this whole business, and keep it alive, I think. And we've got a demonstration of that here. Next in the programme is a buffet lunch, I think upstairs, is it, Urban?
Yes, so that's for invited parties and practitioners for the afternoon session for a lunch in the library.
Great. So with that, can I ask you all to join me in thanking our panellists and indeed all of us for a great session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.